and welcome back to my channel. Today I have an Emboss Resist technique using the Pig Time Fun stamp set from My Favorite Things. This is part of my design team project for the Not Too Shabby Shop. Unfortunately, this stamp set is no longer available, so I will link it in the description box below to a place where you can find it now. Here is a look at my card panel. I have watercolor paper. I'm going to be doing an Emboss Resist technique. Recently I purchased the Uncharted Mariner from Tim Holtz. I have all of the inks, I have the embossing powder or embossing glaze and the paint, and I wanted to play with it and see what colors I really liked with it. Now, when I'm creating masculine cards, which is obviously what we have here today, I tend to use darker colors, and so I stuck with kind of the browns and the blues, and then I added a little bit of green in there. To do my Emboss Resist, first I need to stamp my image on this panel, so I'm using VersaFine ink, Versamark ink, and then I'm going to use some white embossing powder. This is white watercolor paper, as you can see, so clear embossing powder would work just as well as the white. You get a little bit more of a crisper image when you use the white as opposed to just letting the color underneath show through. I melted that. I stamped it 2 more times. Now at some point in my card, I'm going to decide that I'm going to create a frame out of this. I tend to kind of I wanted to play with the Uncharted Mariner. I wanted to use the Pig Time Fun stamp set, but other than that, I really had no idea where this project was going other than I was going to layer up some inks. So I'm adding a lighthouse to this panel. I also add some of the birds, which tend to be more towards the middle, but when I cut out my frame, I'm going to cut out that centerpiece, and so some of those elements are not going to show up on my card, which was fine. It worked out just fine. I have that little panel that I can use on another project later on. When I finish, as I mentioned, with the lighthouse, I do add the birds, and then I'm going to start with my Emboss Resist technique. I am going to start with this panel dry, and I'm going to add some tea dye to my glass mat. This is the Tim Holtz mini glass mat, and then I'll spritz it with some water, and I'm slightly swiping this. I don't want to cover the entire panel. I just want bits of that tea dye here and there, and once I'm finished picking up that ink, I'll use some water on my panel and get that ink to move just a little bit. And by embossing those elements in the background, that is going to resist the ink, so you're going to be able to start seeing what I have stamped. I'll pick some of it up with a cloth at times, so I tend to keep a microfiber cloth right there. You can also use a paper towel for this. That just picks up the excess water. I'm being very careful with my heat tool. Usually I would use my Tim Holtz craft heat tool for this, but I don't have it here with me. In fact, I didn't have my embossing heat gun here until my husband came to visit last week and brought it with him, thank goodness. So as I mentioned, I'm going with some browns. I think that the ocean tends to have a tad bit of green in it, so I've added the evergreen bow, and I did the same thing. I went ahead and added the ink to my mat. These are the mini ink cubes. This is Distress ink, and then I just tap it into that ink, and then I dry it in between. Now I'm going to bring in that Uncharted Mariner. I do have the Distress Oxide spray, and I'm going to spritz this panel a couple of times. At this point, I realize I have all that extra ink on my glass mat, so I'm going to bring in a second watercolor panel, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick this up. So I'll spritz that Uncharted Mariner with water, and then I'm going to use a dry panel, and I'm going to swipe all of this up and pick up this ink. This panel turned out just as pretty, so I'm going to show it to you towards the end of this process. So you can see how much blue there is with that Uncharted Mariner, but I wanted a little bit more green, so I went back in with the evergreen bow. I added it to my glass mat, spritzed it with water, and again I'm doing the tapping. I'll add that second panel over the ink and pick that up, clean up my mess, and bring the tea dye back in once I dry this. The reason that I'm drying in between is it helps set the ink, and it helps the ink layer, as opposed to if the panel was still wet and I added additional ink to it, then the colors are going to gel together, they're going to flow together, and this allows me to get each of the colors a little bit more intense than I would if I tried to add them all at once. This is walnut stain, and I'm going to add some splatters to the panel, and then I'll bring in the nozzle from my Distress spray. So the difference between the Distress Oxide is that you're going to have that white pigment that's incorporated into it, which is the hybrid property of the Distress Oxides, but the Distress inks are going to be much more concentrated. You can see just how deep that blue actually shows up on the panel. I have those little sprays on the left side, and I just spritzed it with some water and picked it up again with this beautiful second panel. So I have that panel right there that I'm going to be able to use on another card at another time. But we are going to add a little bit of depth to the edges so that our eye is going to be drawn in, and it's also going to add a little bit of vintage to this, for lack of a better word. This is the tea dye. I'll go all around the edges, and because I did cut this with the paper trimmer, I'm going to have a white edge all the way around on the outside. So I'm just using that walnut stain, and I'm adding that to the edge, and it's at this point that I decide right here to swipe it. And so I'm just going to go all around the outside edge, and I'm going to barely swipe it across the outside edge of this panel, and I really love the way that this looks. I'll add a little bit of water using a clapping motion to get that ink to move, to get those additional watermarks on this panel. Again, I'm going to pick it up with my microfiber cloth and then dry it. So you can see that the walnut stain did dry back quite a bit, and it really gives a nice look with those little swipes. As I mentioned, I created a frame. This was kind of like, at that point I thought, you know what, I'm going to create kind of like a picture frame. So I used one of my infinity dies to cut out the center, and then I used the same size infinity rectangle and one that was 2 sizes larger to create this frame. This frame is actually going to be a mat on the inside of my card. So I'll add the tea dye around the outside of this. I'm going to do some ink blending. I won't show all of it on camera just for the sake of time. Once I'm finished, I do end up spritzing this with a little bit of water, picking it up with my microfiber cloth, and then drying it. I adhered the frame to the center of the Uncharted Mariner frame. Now, when I created the matting, there was a center white piece that cut out, and I decided to utilize that to create some waves. I have a stamp that's from the Seize the Day stamp set. It's a really great sentiment set for beachy themes that Honeybee Stamps recently released, and I'm going to do some Emboss Resist again. So I did stamp it using Versamark ink. I added the white embossing powder and then my heat tool to melt it. I'm going to start with Salty Ocean, and then I'm going to add some Stormy Sky. Now, the Salty Ocean is going to be a little bit stark against that Uncharted Mariner and the darker background that I've created. So in order for it to fit a little bit better into my composition, I'm going to deepen the outside edges with some Stormy Sky. Again, I'm going to activate the ink with some water, and now you can see just how pretty that is inside my frame. it's going to fit perfectly in my frame. So normally I would have cut this a little bit bigger, but I am going to add foam tape to the back of it. I'll use some purple tape to get it in place. I want the sentiment up a little bit higher. I wanted the waves higher. You could add a second layer of waves if you wanted to. That would have looked really nice, but I kept it pretty simple with just one layer. Once I get this adjusted, I'll add my foam tape to the back of this. My finished card is going to be 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, so I will bring in a side folding card base, and I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending in the background. Again, I don't want to use my tumbled glass. It's a little bit too light for the look that I'm going for, so I went with my broken china, and I'm just using my brush to go to add the ink directly to the card panel. I'll remove the release paper from my frame, and then I'll add that to this card panel, and I'll have a nice scene for my sailboat. Now for the sailboat, I did color it off camera, and I did use my brother's scan and cut. I'll link the colors that I used for the sails and for the body of the boat in the description box below. All of the products that I've used will be linked in the description box below, except for the distress inks, because you know, you can buy those almost anywhere. You can buy them at Michael's, you can buy them at Hobby Lobby. So I have this whole scene centered to my card. I strategically placed my foam tape so those waves are going to stay on the inside. But I noticed that when I die cut, or when I cut this out with my brother's scan and cut, that the white from the inside of the sails would have been the sky, and it was just standing out a little bit too much. So I have these little blending brushes that are for chalk paint, but they work really well with distress inks. I was getting some blotchiness with it. I typically would have brought my Dove blender pen in, which I don't have with me, and that would have helped move this ink around, but I went with the next best thing, and I tried my colorless blender from my Copic marker. I wasn't sure if I was going to ruin it. I figured I may as well try this, and it really did add and move the color beautifully, just like the Dove blender pen does. So I cleaned it off really well onto another piece of paper once I was finished, and I can use that colorless blender on with my Copic markers, and I'm not going to have any problems contaminating anything. So once I smooth this out, I will add some adhesive to the back of it. I'm going to place it kind of at an angle with the front of the boat kind of sticking up like it's coming up out of the waves, and that will complete my card for today. So I want to thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed watching how this card came together. I think that the evergreen bow and the tea dye and the walnut stain really went well with the Uncharted Mariner. I can't wait to work with some other combinations. Here's a look at my card. If you like the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, like it, and subscribe. Until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day. Thanks so much for watching.